Yeah, okay. So I'd like to welcome everybody today to this DAFNI webinar, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Robert Nicholls from the University of East Anglia, where he is director of the Tyndall Centre and Professor of Climate Adaptation. And we in DAFNI have had had the privilege of working with Robert and his team on a project over the last couple of years called OpenCLIM, and today we've asked Robert to come and give that presentation to tell us more about OpenCLIM and what it's done. So I will hand straight over to Robert to start his presentation.
Okay, well, thank you, Brian. So I think, is my presentation up? I'm not sure. I'm
yes.
Not clear. Good. Okay. Yeah. Excellent. Right. So, well, thanks very much for that introduction. So I'm going to talk about OpenCLIM. So this was the Open Climate Impact Modelling Framework. So this is a project that was ran for about sort of 3 years. It has formally finished now, although we're as I'll explain as we're going through, we're still continuing to develop it. And it was led by UEA, with Newcastle University having a big role, and also partners, the University of Bristol, CEH, Sayers and Partners, and then DAFNI and STFC as well as partners. So what inspires this project? Well, really, it's the climate change risk assessments. So the Climate Change Act in 2008 mandated that every 5 years there would be a climate change risk assessment. So the third one was published in 2021. And this little picture here envisages the kind of some of the products that are produced within the CCRA, which really tries to look at what are the climate risks that the UK faces. And here is the sort of overview report, advice to government from the Climate Change Committee on what the risks are, and sort of and a sort of ranking of the risks. And supporting this is a series of reports. So there's a technical report, I think led by the Met Office, that really sort of provided a lot of the information about the climate risks in the third assessment report. And then there are sort of products that are to the devolved administrations as well. So there's the example here is a summary for Scotland. And then the CCRA actually also leads to a national adaptation plan. So it's a number of documents that sort of feed through. So this is a devolved thing. This happens in each, so it happens in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. This is the NAP produced in 2023 by DEFRA for England. So basically the 2021 report comes up with the risks, and then the national adaptation plan talks about what's going to be done about those risks. And so we've had this cycle of assessment, 3 cycles of assessment. And one of the things that you'd see, I mean, I think that each assessment's got better, but one of the questions was, how can we use existing models to really produce much more spatially granular information in a consistent way? So that's maybe the overarching kind of question that OpenCLIM was sort of, and the call that led to OpenCLIM was addressing. So the OpenCLIM project is really designed to support this UK level climate change risk assessment and national adaptation plans. And the question is, how can we link existing models and data sets in a consistent and repeatable manner to produce spatially explicit products? And so really we're talking here about sort of maps, and sort of rather than just talking about risks in broad terms, actually seeing the potential for differences, the potential for hotspots, things like that. And some of the kind of key words that kind of almost come out here is climate risks and adaptation, obviously some climate scenarios. Also, the future is going to be different in other ways. So socioeconomic scenarios, workflows, how do we sort of put all this stuff together? The idea of legacy is really important. So it's a very big piece of research that has to lead to something that can exist after a funded project. That's really important. So legacy of models, workflows, and the data that we produce. And so that naturally led to a sort of role for DAFNI in this work, with DAFNI really helping us think about the workflow structure that we might employ. what kinds of data repositories that we might produce, and legacy. I mean, you know, as I said, the funded work of OpenCLIM has ended. DAFNI continues. So I think that's really a very important role to acknowledge at this moment. So moving on then to OpenCLIM then. So the overall aims is really an assessment method for CCRA 4 and beyond. There are going to be CCRA 5, etc. So, I mean, it's a process. And then to enhance the UK's capability to assess climate risks and adaptation choices. And I suppose it's about climate change risks, but it's also about adaptation. We have the NAP, and how can those risks be modified and hopefully reduced by adaptation? And so the vision then really is an integrated risk and adaptation models to sort of link these across multiple sectors in an open framework, and a process that integrates models to facilitate science policy development. So really, this is very much about that last step from science to the use of science in policy, I think, which is an important. So, you know, it's very much about sort of the impact, if you like, of these models. And the innovation, I think, is consistent and spatially explicit results, identifying risk hotspots, so, you know, including sort of compound risks and these idea of detailed maps, and assessing adaptation. So to give you a picture of the OpenCLIM framework, this is a picture we kind of developed really at the very beginning of the project, and it stood the test of time in that we start with ideas of climate scenarios and socio-economic scenarios, and we take hold of the sort of exposure, the hazard exposure vulnerability model, because then we look at how climate scenarios are changing hazard, but then also how vulnerability and exposure are evolving as well. And then integrating all that into a risk assessment. And, you know, there was a lot of stakeholder engagement in OpenCLIM. We spent quite a bit of time talking to stakeholders about what they wanted from this process, and then talking with domain experts about how to use what they wanted in specific sectors. And the sectors will come up in the next sort of press of the button here. So, but what people wanted were impacts for 2 and 4 degrees. They were interested in 2 socioeconomic scenarios: the UK SSP2, the UK SSP4. We did look at other socioeconomic scenarios, but this is what came from the stakeholders, and they're interested in the baseline, the 2050s, and the 2080s. So in terms of time frame, so that sort of conditioned how we produced our final results. In terms of what we looked at, there wasn't enough resource to look at every sector. So we looked actually mainly at terrestrial sectors. So there's actually no coasts in the OpenCLIM demonstration. And this is a demonstration project. And the sort of 6 factors we looked at were urban development. So that's not really climate directly, but it's again, this issue of looking at changes to vulnerability and exposure. It's a very key part of the analysis. Then we looked at agriculture, biodiversity, flooding, heat stress, and drought, and a water supply. And DAFNI there in the bottom, again, sort of a key discipline and repository for all of our work throughout. And then lastly, adaptation was fundamental. So we did think about adaptation, and we thought about adaptation at different scales. We recognized that you can adapt by, you know, with flooding, you can build a defense at a property, or you can build a property in a different location, but that's dealing with the problem at the scale of the property. Equally, you could actually think about nature-based solutions in the catchment and try and slow the flood wave. And so we recognized that we could also change the hazard, so how climate affects runoff. And we did look at some nature-based solutions, and we thought that did the same with exposure and vulnerability. So we are thinking about adaptation at multiple scales. And I think that's because we're thinking about a landscape view, we can take on board those types of questions. Where are we working? Well, you know, internationally, I think we've already defined that, and the devolved administration but also we are looking at subnational as well. We started off with the sort of Clyde and the sort of Norfolk as two regions we originally proposed to, and the work kind of grew through the project. So we had the Highland Council, Northern Ireland, and the Fens. And the Fens is an active project at the present time with the Environment Agency. And those three pieces of work, the three subnational areas, are being written up as papers. So they're going to be formally published. In terms of the outputs, we've got these different modeling workflows, and then this kind of, again, quite a lot of information on this slide, just to give you an impression, I think, really, of the different outputs. And I suppose in terms of resolution, you can see that we're working at resolutions from sort of 100 meters and up, often at sort of in fact 20 meters with biodiversity, but generally at sort of 1 kilometer is a very common scale, but then for heat stress, 12 kilometers, water supply, we're looking at water resource zones. So there are different resolutions depending on the question that is being posed. In terms of adaptation, this isn't a piece of modeling. We actually did produce an assessment of the adaptation power report. So these are reports which DEFRA commissioned, where they actually asked different groups to report on what they're doing about adaptation. And so we reviewed the available literature. We also looked at the peer-reviewed literature, but most of the examples came from the power reports, and created an adaptation inventory of what's actually going on the ground. So this isn't theoretical. These are practical measures that are being done, and we published a paper on it. So that's available on the NISMOD database for those that are interested in terms of the adaptation inventory. If we look at then some of the results that we produced, sort of vulnerability, the urban development work, I'm just going to give you now a flavour of some of the results that we produced. And so the urban development model that was hosted at Newcastle is what we're talking about here. And so we took population scenarios in panel A, mapped from the SSPs at the local authority scale. So we have an additional, so each SSP then basically imposes an additional, or maybe in a few cases there's a fall in population, but in this case we actually here are using SSP 5. That's not one of the ones recommended, but it gives the biggest population change. So it's got the biggest sort of signal. So where's there a demand for population? Then they look at suitability surfaces, and these suitability surfaces vary with the SSP. There's a narrative behind the SSPs that tells you what's attracting or not attracting, repelling, if you like, future development. And so in SSP 5, there's a strong attraction to existing areas of development. So you can see those sort of green areas around the existing urban areas. And then in number 3, future urban development, simulated at a sort of 1 hectare grid scale. And you could see sort of the red areas appearing. So those are the new urban areas. And then lastly, to think about what form, depending on the density of the development, that we actually create a sort of a synthetic building density, which actually gives you a sort of urban fabric. So you can actually apply risk models and look at maybe things like flood damage. Are you dealing with tower blocks, or are you dealing with single family homes, etc.? And the decisions about these urban fabrics are based on the density of buildings and empirical information about what development we find in the UK. So moving on from that, then the CityCap model, which again hosted at Newcastle, was looking at urban flooding, and this worked, I think, actually at 2 meter resolution, so very high resolution. In the panel, you can sort of see an existing urban area, and under the SSP4, you can see new development. And so, the red areas are new buildings, and some of those going into areas that are affected by urban flooding. And over on the panels, you can actually sort of see the changes due to with increased urban development. You can actually sort of again start to see this spatial pattern of where damages are rising in the urban in CityCat for a constant storm event. So actually here, in many ways, here we're sort of in those pictures, we're holding climate constant, and the main driver there of increased risk is the urbanization. And in the table, you can see sort of different indicative damages and the increases that you're seeing. And the idea here is we've done the demonstrations of this on a number of cities, Newcastle, Norwich, Inverness, and this could be then done for all sort of urban areas in the UK. It's about 10% of the area in the climate change risk assessment. So again, this can be done, but the scale of analysis in OpenCLIM was for a few selected cities to demonstrate the approach. In terms of UK heat mortality, this is work done between Bristol and UEA. It kind of gives you the baseline: 2 degrees in 2050, 2 degrees in 2080, and 4 degrees in 2080. And this is giving you the average annual heat-related deaths. And so you've got a constant population, so you can see the number of people, the number of average deaths is rising as we go from baseline to 2 degrees to 4 degrees, and basically the numbers for the baseline are the same in 2050 and 2080 under 2 degrees, because but then you can see that basically then with increased population, and we have SSP2, 4, and 5 here. So 5 again being the biggest increase in population. You can see the sort of socioeconomic effect that the number of deaths is rising, also not because of higher temperatures, but additionally because there's more people to be affected. So the future populations are quite important, and the over 85, so understanding the composition of the population is quite important. And then that leads, so those are aggregated figures, then this leads to different maps which show you the expansion of the number of heat-related deaths across the country. And I mean, probably what's striking actually visually here is you actually see that you're getting the occurrence of deaths in Northern Ireland and Scotland, where in the baseline there's hardly any issues there. But actually, when you look at the increase, the numbers there, clearly most of the greatest risk and the greatest increase in deaths is in southern and central England. So that's where the largest numbers are occurring. With maybe a growth of up to 11,000 in deaths under these scenarios. And then sort of loss of biodiversity. This is looking at the projected sort of species extinction in areas currently identified as natural. And what this is showing is that you see lowest losses essentially. It's true in both 2 and 4 degrees. In 4 degrees, the extinctions are higher, so there's no migration in with these simulations, but the extinctions are lower in basically the upland areas. So that's in the west and the north, and so that's the areas in dark brown are sort of are 55 to 60% fewer sort of species. So we have this sort of quite detailed information here about this. in terms of then agriculture, this is work done by CEH, and the baseline 2 degrees and 4 degrees of warming. And again, this is an interesting plot in terms of a map, because 2 degrees, you're seeing some losses in the south east of the country, but certainly with 4 degrees, they're becoming much more obvious to the eye. So that so we're having problems, really in the south. But clearly in Scotland, actually wheat is doing much better. So you're starting to see some of these sort of regional differences. Not to say that the production in Scotland is going to compensate for the loss of production in England, but there are different stories here depending on where you are in the UK. And also, CEH did that was PropNet was the model used for the wheat. This is EcoCrop. This is an FAO model where they actually looked at, well, what might come in, as they looked at what would be in trouble, but also what might come in. What are the crops that are maybe being grown right now in the middle of France that could, or wherever, that might well be suitable to move in to the into the UK. And so you could see for different regions here, sort of the crops that are the 10 field crops that show the greatest increase in suitability for 2 degrees, both for Scotland, East Anglia, and the southwest. And also crops that are showing declines in suitability. And for example, well, strawberries always, well, it sticks out with me that strawberries seem to do badly regardless in the UK, and other crops listed there. One of the interesting things with OpenCLIM was sort of, again, make the point about using existing models. And the RU model, the water resources model for England and Wales, is used by the Environment Agency for looking at water supply issues, and sort of and really sort of regulatory issues over the next sort of 20-25 years. But it's a physics-based model, so it's quite sensible to also use this model for longer-term questions, maybe to looking at the issue of climate change risks. I mean, again, it's a process-based model, so as long as you use it appropriately, you can start to ask other questions of it, questions beyond those that were possibly in the mind when it was originally designed. And obviously, the Environment Agency is also very keen for this model to be used because they believe it and trust it, and it means that what they're saying about climate will be consistent with what they're saying in sort of the regulatory world at a shorter time scale. So RU sits actually on DAFNI. And so what was done within OpenCLIM was a discussion about how can we actually, an exploratory attempt to use this to sort of look at slightly different scenarios from what we were showing there, but just beginning to think about how it could be used. So low environmental ambition, high environmental ambition, and low adaptation and high adaptation, and looking at various sort of metrics, and just to kind of go to some results from this. These are being worked up right now into a paper, and these are quite sort of this is something that's been going on since OpenCLIM actually finished. So we have the no adaptation plot to the left, and then I mentioned this sort of quadratic: low environmental ambition, high, and then low and high adaptation. And you can see where will there be a probability of a yearly shortfall in water for different water resource zones. Some water resource zones aren't modelled; they're the ones that are in grey. So it's not covering all of England and Wales. But what you can see is that that if we move to a sort of from the no adaptation, we can. It's certainly possible to get many of those bright red colours down. But if we go for a high environmental ambition, so we want to release more water to the environment, that's also can cause issues. So there is a trade-off here, which is again starting to tease out some of these issues. And then you could also look to the right. Then the difference from the baseline is apparent in the plots to the right. So in general, there's a benefit from action, but occasionally with a high environmental ambition, you do get issues emerging due to the increased demand of water for the environment. So this is again very sort of promising for and hopefully this will help to feed into this kind of knowledge going into CCRA4. And then one of the things we said at the beginning really was about a common view. And so this view here is saying, well, let's look at 2 degrees for a number of different sectors. So we haven't gone through all these sectors, but here you are stacked up. It's a series of maps showing you heat stress. You saw that already. Flooding. So this is looking at the 1% flow, and what and you could see basically an increase in 1% flow in the west, a decrease in the east. So there's again a spatial pattern there. Drought, here we're using the Q95 river flow as an indicator of drought. And again, river flow, so Q95 falls everywhere. It gets warmer, it's drying things out. Even if we get higher flows, sometimes the net effect is still drying out. But it tends to dry a little bit more in the east. So that east-west pattern is there. Agriculture, you saw this one already. And biodiversity, you saw this one already. But I just say, making the point, we have the 5 maps stacked side by side. We could start to look at ideas around hotspots and other things. What areas have been hit by multiple issues? So just sort of summary, what do we find? Heat-related mortality, well, increases in most areas, but particularly, in southern and eastern England. Drought and water supply, well, future warming increases the number of duration of low flow, which is our indicator for droughts, particularly in the east. Agriculture, well, we can see winners and losers. With most areas of reduced yield in England and gains in Scotland. Biodiversity is impacted by each additional increment of warming, with the most resilient refugia in Scotland and northern England. Flooding, sort of modest increases in the north and west, modest decreases in the east, but there's large interannual variability. So that means extreme events may increase in frequency. So the idea of drought going up and floods going up is not an unrealistic view of the future. And maybe we're in that world already. Because we're not far off, we're not far off 1.5 degrees and we're getting close to 2. Natural flood management has been quantified, and it can help to manage flood risk. And that's something else that, well, beyond the funded period is still being sort of worked up. But that's really quite exciting that we were able to link together all these different models to get some quantification of that, not just qualitative treatment. So what do we learn? What are the wider issues? Well, I think this kind of project, with developing a consistent framework, is a substantial effort. But by working together in a sustained manner, the difficult questions of consistency can be addressed. So it's I think really, that we started this project in COVID, so that was maybe we didn't have meet face to face for quite a while. Towards the end, we were having quite a lot of workshops, and that was really very productive. And I think, but getting people in the room, listening to each other from different sectors is very valuable, and hearing what others are doing and the problems they're solving and how the problems they have and how they're solving them is very productive. Socioeconomic scenarios are as important as climate scenarios. The UK SSPs are good. They provide explicit and common realizations of the future, and they promote consistency. We did find, though, SSPs work very well with national stakeholders, but actually I mentioned these projects in Highland, etc. Actually, local stakeholders may not so readily work with the SSP. So that's something to think about for the future, I think. They often think about, well, they may have a plan, and what would happen if they followed a particular plan. Certainly, the spatially explicit results are very powerful tools to show patterns of change and engage with diverse stakeholders. The subnational application of the results certainly adds value. And I suppose one of the key points is one of the attractions for this is that the stakeholders at the local scale think, well, we're using the same results as government. Now, of course, these results haven't gone to CCRA4, but but they would like the thought that they're using consistent results that have been produced nationally, and they'd like to be using the CCRA4 results when they're available. So, and we continue to work between these different sort of regional sort of views. And lastly, well, DAFNI, it's a DAFNI webinar. Well, certainly DAFNI facilitates the OpenCLIM legacy. The OpenCLIM project. In the OpenCLIM, there's two aspects of OpenCLIM. OpenCLIM is a vision. So it's something that we have created, and we continue to work on that vision, and hopefully we get more funding to look at that. We are working in defence, as I mentioned already, but it was a project, and the project does actually end. So DAFNI gives that legacy, and that's really important. And DAFNI is continuing to work on this. To make this work more available. So in terms of sort of getting data, well, a data visualization tool has been developed and it's progressing slowly. I think one of the things despite putting all this together, you find some of these seemingly simple things are always a little bit harder than you think. So data visualization is something that is coming, but is not quite where we want it to be. Developing a set of papers on the integrated methods and the integrated results, so including these sort of local ones has already been mentioned, and as and a lot of sort of technical details are being written up. We're finalising the assessment of the nature-based catchment adaptation, and we're also drawing together this use of the Environment Agency RU model. And I think there's also reflection on the lessons learned and with others. So people external to the OpenCLIM Consortium, people like the Met Office, they were on the advisory board of the project. And what are the lessons for CCRA4 from this? How do they make sure the climate scenarios are CCRA4 ready? So again, those discussions I think have helped in that regard. We're continuing to see the regional applications, as I've already mentioned that. In terms of outputs, there's more than 600 model results, maps, and tables available through DAFNI. The Jasmine data is being migrated to CEDAR shortly as well to make it more available. The data visualization tool is progressing, and the workflows are available on DAFNI to support community modeling development. And then, and to give a view of the visualization tool, this is sort of just shows sort of the urban land use data. There's not really any color gradient here, but just shows you how you can sort of pick out. And this will be a very friendly way of accessing the data. And what about the lessons from DAFNI, I suppose? Well, I think OpenCLIM and all the projects I think that work with DAFNI, but OpenCLIM was very computationally intensive. So the OpenCLIM was critical in driving I think the direction of the DAFNI platform. It really helped to sort of to road test it, and it was a heavyweight user of the workflows, and it's clearly as we used OpenCLIM, that helped us to see things where DAFNI could be improved. So it helped to really focus that. And just here are just sort of 3 things that have already been implemented in DAFNI to make it more usable by OpenCLIM. And I think this work continues and that's really the sort of key point. And certainly, you know, Brian Matthews and Bethan Perkins, who are on the call, have been very much involved with all that work and leading that work in making that happen. So they may well have some sort of comments from the DAFNI perspective on that aspect. So with that, thank you, and I'll happily take any questions.
Thank you, Robert. We have had a question come in. Could you explain more what a high environmental ambition might look like, and what would be the adaptations needed?
Oh, what for the higher that with the water supply, that would really be, if I'm understanding the question correctly, I'm assuming it links to the room model and the water supply question. So that that would be one where basically the amount of water available to environmental use was much higher than it is today. So a high environmental ambition, and so that would therefore put more constraint on the water that's available for human use, because essentially we're giving more water to the environment. So base flows in rivers would be higher, things like that. So that's what, in that context, that's specifically what it means, if I'm understanding the question correctly. If I'm not, please come back and refine the question.
Thank you. Just wait and see if any more questions come through.
I thought there was a question from Kyle. He thought he put his hand up, or maybe he then put it down again.
There's nothing else in the Q&A at the moment. So Kyle, if you did have a question, if you want to pop it in there, I can read it.
Maybe I can ask a question while we're waiting. So we looked at the project, mostly looked at the sort of 6 scenario areas that we're looking at. Were there any areas that you would feel would be particularly valuable to add as another area?
Well, the obvious one would be coasts. I mean, I think I said we didn't look at coastal areas, and so when you look at the flood maps, quite large areas of catchments which are influenced by coastal water levels and sea level were not considered. So I think that would really be a very obvious extension. And then really thinking about coastal. So thinking about both the interaction between river catchments and the sea. And then you start to get into questions around compound floods and how events can be triggered not by one driver, but maybe by reasonably high flow and reasonably high sea levels happening at the same time, for example. And also looking at, there's many places like Portsmouth or downstream of London where the main driver is storm surge, and it's not really, and compound may have an effect, but fundamentally it's high sea levels that are the problem, and that is a big issue around our coast. So yeah, I would say, and then going beyond that, another thing that there's also the issues around sort of things like how these results are used by, say, economic assessments really as well. So we've done essentially the biophysical, and then we've gone through into risk. But then also there's clearly a suite of analysis that happens in the CCRA that's above that, which looks at the economic implications of some of these changes, and so interfacing with that to make sure that the results are as useful as they can be for that kind of analysis, because at the end of the day I think that economic analysis is quite influential on what government does for these issues. So that's an important interface that we thought about, but we could road test whether it works. There's quite a few questions coming up now, isn't there?
Now coming in, yes.
Yeah, so the next one, do any of the scenarios include collapse of the Gulf Stream?
No, I mean, basically, this framework would take any scenario you liked. We took 2 and 4 degrees from the UKCP 18 scenarios. So they are sort of standard scenarios. So there are no abrupt changes, but there's no reason why we can't include almost any scenario. Although, of course, that would be a global cooling scenario. So that would be an interesting scenario to investigate, because some of the scenarios I've seen in a recent paper are so dramatic that it would need a little bit of thought, I think, to do that credibly. But so no, the short answer is no.
Thank you. Is there ambition to expand the framework to other sectors?
Yes, I mean, I think the question Brian asked, I think, sort of partly answered this. But yes, I think this is something that would like to see expanded. And also, well, another thing to think about really is more representation of adaptation in the sectors that we looked at. So there are different degrees of freedom. You can add more sectors and look at the risks essentially with little adaptation. There's also the issue of adding in a wider range of adaptations into the analysis, and then this issue about really how you interface this information with other decision-making frameworks. I mentioned sort of economic appraisal, which is very influential to how government thinks about these issues. So there's a huge amount to be done, and yes, we would like to explore all those questions.
Thank you. How do you see this work being used and built on in the future?
Well, we've got all the data sets available, so they're available on DAFNI to download, so they can be used in research, and so we hope that others will look at these. There's also quite a lot of interest now. There's a big UKRI program in adaptation, so that's again a place where these adaptation hubs, which are trying to promote adaptation across the UK. So we'd sort of see our work as feeding into that. There are various calls to do with sort of net zero, which look at climate risks and mitigation together and look at land use. And I think because we're modeling the landscape, we can actually usefully say things about some of these landscape changes, the biodiversity, the agriculture, the catchment level, etc. And self-evidently, there's also the CCRA4 itself. That's obviously what was fundamentally designed to serve. And so I think the results, we're writing the papers, so the results themselves will feed into the CCRA4, and we would hope that the model capacity would also be taken up and used. But that's something that obviously is sort of emerging right now. The CCC are doing various reviews, so I think our results are sort of feeding in to those reviews about our capacity to look at different risks at the current time. So I think that's the current state of play. In terms of agriculture, yes, we did model for crops other than wheat. The crops were, let's think, my mind's gone blank. Oilseed rape and grass were modeled with CropNet. So there are detailed models of those two crops with CropNet, and then because I mean those are the three biggest crops by area, which is why they were selected. And then in the eco crop work, there was about, I think if I remember correctly, 200 crops were looked at, including winners and losers, and so that data is also available, and that's been written up as a paper at the current time. So if you're interested in that, maybe you can approach me, drop me an email, and I'll happily can connect you with CEH. I'm sort of involved with that paper, but CEH led that work, so that's probably the place to go in. So Marion's question, how will these results be used for future climate assessment modelling with the Climate Change Committee? Well, I think that depends to some extent on what the CCC decide to commission, Marion. As I said, right now there's a number of assessments going on of climate risks and our capacity to assess climate risk. And I suppose what the CCC is doing is trying to sort of understand where have we got new knowledge that we didn't have in 2021, or the work that went into the 2021 assessment. Obviously, that really was looking at more 2019 and 2020, really. I think here we do have new knowledge because we do have these quite nice spatially explicit patterns which allow you to distinguish things like wheat going down in large parts of England and going up in Scotland and also Northern Ireland, I think, to some degree. But that's for the CCC to decide how useful is that. So there's going to be there will be an assessment there about using these models directly, or will they simply take the outputs that we've produced and run with those? So that's something that is up to the CCC. And so in terms of the government policy, I think we've demonstrated that this capability is quite powerful. So I think we're probably also influencing the science debate to some extent, and also platforms like, I suppose, DAFNI, really. I mean, these sort of national capabilities. So we hope, both the Climate Change Committee would like to use this, and we hope for more research, but research that's focused maybe on both improving the model capability, but also improving the ability to use the models and thinking about doing maybe more simulations. Some of the other questions have touched already on maybe scenarios that people might want to look that are quite different to the scenarios we ran. So that's something that we'll see. And then, are you implementing any semantic web framework for modeling? Not at the present time. That's not something that we've really considered, but that's a good question. And I think probably next time I talk to Bethan and Brian, we'll probably have a discussion about that. It's a good question. Do you have any comments to make on that, Brian or Bethan?
I would comment that there are some other projects that we've been involved with, which have some similar characteristics to OpenCLIM, that have used semantic webs to kind of or semantic networks to define sort of patterns of connections between different things, and you could see that would be something you could, if you're looking for specific vulnerabilities, that's something you could add to an OpenCLIM framework. I would think, yeah. Okay. So there may be potential there.
Well, thank you for the question. That's good. Useful stimulation there. Was one of the reasons we do these webinars, isn't it? It's two-way. You learn something, but hopefully we do as well.
Thank you, Robert. I'm just double checking. I don't think there's any more questions. So does anyone have any final questions just before we finish the webinar today? Wait a second. Do you have anything else, Brian?
No. Apart from thanking Robert for a really interesting presentation, a really, a great summarization of the results of this project, which I think really does demonstrate some of the potential effects and what might happen in the future in these different climate change scenarios, and sort of we hope will change the way that, and affect the way that the government and policymakers take their decisions in the future, because some of the worst case scenarios can be quite alarming. So thank you very much for that, Robert. It's been an incredibly interesting talk and a very, very good project. We really enjoyed it.
Okay. Can you stay on for a second, Brian? Just ask you something when everybody else is gone. That'd be great. Thank you. Well, thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Robert.